Welcome to ShadowLore. Get ready for a chilling road trip. In this video, we share 4 scary true road trip horror stories that will make you think twice before hitting the highway. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let's go. It was supposed to be a fun, laid-back road trip. A few friends, an open road, and no real plan other than to explore the back roads of the country. It was the kind of adventure we had been talking about for years, and finally, we had the chance to make it happen. We were 3 days in, and so far it had been exactly what we wanted. Long drives, good music, and the occasional quirky roadside attraction. But on that 3rd day, something shifted. We'd been driving for hours, the sun gradually dipping lower, until it disappeared behind the horizon, leaving us with only the faint glow of twilight and the endless stretch of empty road. The towns we passed were few and far between, and every gas station or diner we encountered seemed frozen in time, relics from decades long gone. We hadn't planned where to stay that night, figuring we'd just stop wherever we found a cheap motel, but now we were regretting that decision. We hadn't seen a place to stay in hours, and the tension in the car was thick. Everyone was tired, and we were starting to get irritable. Then, we saw it. A worn-out, faded sign on the side of the road read, "Westbrook Motel, Vacancy." It was old, the paint peeling, but it was the first sign of civilization we'd seen in miles. Without a second thought, I took the exit and followed the gravel road leading up to the motel. As we pulled into the parking lot, a strange sense of unease washed over me. The motel looked abandoned. It was a single-story building, the kind you'd expect to see in a movie from the 70s, with a flickering neon sign that barely illuminated the cracked pavement below. There were no other cars in the lot, no lights in any of the windows. Just a long row of doors, all shut tight, like the place had been sealed off from the world. But the neon sign above the office still read, "Vacancy." "We should keep driving," James muttered from the passenger seat. His voice was low, uncertain. "We're not going to find another place for miles," I said, though part of me agreed with him. I could feel that strange, heavy tension in the air, but we were all too tired to care. Reluctantly, we parked the car, the gravel crunching under the tires. The 4 of us climbed out, stretching our legs after the long drive. The air was cold and still, almost unnaturally so. There wasn't a single sound, no crickets, no wind, nothing. Just silence. The office door creaked as we stepped inside, and the smell hit us immediately. Mildew, old wood, and something else. Something sour that I couldn't quite place. Behind the counter sat a woman, maybe in her 50s, with graying hair tied back in a loose bun. Her skin was pale, almost translucent under the flickering fluorescent light. She didn't smile when we walked in. In fact, she barely looked at us, her eyes fixed on something just above our heads. "Need a room," I said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. She didn't respond for a moment, just stared at us with those cold, glassy eyes. Then, without a word, she reached under the counter and pulled out an old-fashioned key, sliding it across the desk toward me. "Room 12, she muttered, her voice raspy like she hadn't spoken in days. As we turned to leave, she added, "Lock the door, and don't leave after midnight." I stopped, turning back to look at her, but her eyes were already back on whatever invisible thing she'd been staring at before. My skin prickled with unease, but I forced a smile and nodded, pushing the weird encounter to the back of my mind. We were all too tired to care about anything except getting to the room and passing out. The room was what you'd expect from a place like that. Threadbare carpet, peeling wallpaper, and a smell that made you wrinkle your nose the second you walked in. The bed was lumpy. The TV was an old box-style set that looked like it hadn't worked in years, and the single window was covered by heavy, dark curtains that let in no light. James flopped onto the bed with a groan. "This place is a dump," he said, but his voice was tired, not angry. "Better than sleeping in the car," I replied, trying to make light of the situation, though something still felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something about the room that made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the stale air or the oppressive darkness outside, but it felt like the walls were closing in. We all settled in, too exhausted to argue or look for another option. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the others drift off to sleep one by one. James was the first, his snores filling the room almost immediately. Then Sarah and Emily curled up on the other bed, their breathing steady and rhythmic. But I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, the uneasy feeling gnawing at my stomach. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something. Soft footsteps, a faint tapping sound, like someone gently knocking on the door. But when I opened my eyes, the room was still, silent. It must have been past midnight when it happened. At first, it was just a soft shuffle, like someone dragging their feet outside the door. I told myself it was just my imagination, that maybe it was a branch scraping against the building in the wind. But then, there was a knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. No one else stirred. I glanced over at James, still snoring. The knocking came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure why I even bothered. There was no answer. I forced myself to sit up, my body trembling. The room felt colder now, and the air seemed thicker, like it was pressing down on me. My instincts were screaming at me to stay put, but I couldn't. Slowly, I slid out of bed, my feet barely making a sound on the rough carpet as I approached the door. My hand hovered over the handle. I hesitated, every nerve in my body telling me not to open it. But I had to know. I had to see. I unlocked the door, the sound of the deadbolt echoing through the silence. I cracked it open, just enough to peer out. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, the dim light casting long shadows along the walls. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. Then, just as I was about to shut the door, I saw it. Down at the far end of the hallway, near the last room, there was a figure. A tall, dark figure standing perfectly still, facing me. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were looking right at me. I could feel my heart racing as I stood frozen in place. The figure was motionless, but I could sense a heaviness in the air, a tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. For a brief moment, I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, fueled by the creepy atmosphere of the motel. But as I blinked, the figure was still there, an unyielding shadow at the end of the hall. I felt a surge of fear. What was I supposed to do? Call out? Run back into my room? I took a shaky breath and whispered, "Who's there?" No answer. Just silence. The figure shifted slightly, and in that moment, I realized it was moving toward me. Panic surged through me, and I slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. I backed away, my heart pounding as I pressed my back against the wall, breathing heavily. "James, wake up!" I hissed, shaking him as hard as I could. His eyes fluttered open, groggy and confused. "What's wrong?" he mumbled, glancing around the dim room. "There's someone out there," I whispered, my voice trembling. I could hardly believe what I was saying. It sounded crazy even to me. He sat up, still half asleep. "What do you mean? Someone in the motel?" "Yes, at the end of the hall. I saw them." My voice was frantic now, and I could hear the fear in my own words. James rubbed his eyes, clearly not fully awake yet. Okay. Let's just look. You're probably imagining things." He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up, and I felt a mix of relief and dread. Together, we crept back to the door. I hesitated again, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if it's someone dangerous? I whispered. He shot me an annoyed glance. We can't just stay in here forever. Let's check it out. With that, he turned the knob and pushed the door open, and we stepped into the hallway. It was just as I had left it, empty and silent. My heart was pounding as we slowly made our way to the end of the hall, every creak of the floorboards echoing loudly in the stillness. "See? There's nobody here," James said, though I could tell he was trying to reassure himself more than me. I nodded, but I still felt a chill running down my spine. We reached the last room, and I hesitated, glancing back at James. What if... Before I could finish, the door swung open. There was a man standing in the doorway. He was disheveled, wearing a tattered jacket and dirty jeans. His hair was long and unkempt, and his eyes were wild, darting around like he was looking for something, or someone. "Hey, you gotta help me!" he shouted, panic etched across his face. "They're coming! You have to hide me!" My blood ran cold. I looked at James, and he looked back at me, his face a mix of confusion and fear. "Who are you?" James asked, his voice low. "They're going to find me. You don't understand." The man was breathing heavily now, his eyes wide with terror. "I saw them. They're watching. Please." I felt a wave of dread wash over me. "Who's watching?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. But before he could answer, a loud bang echoed through the hallway. The motel walls shook, and the lights flickered violently. The man's face went pale, and he backed away from the door. "They're here!" he screamed, darting past us and down the hallway. "What the hell is happening?" I shouted, but my words were swallowed by the chaos. I grabbed James's arm, pulling him back into our room, slamming the door shut and locking it. "What do we do?" he asked, panic in his voice. "We stay quiet," I whispered, trying to calm my racing heart. "Maybe they won't find us." We huddled in the darkness, listening to the chaos outside. Footsteps echoed through the hallway, and I could hear muffled voices. They were searching for someone, and the fear in my gut twisted tighter. Minutes felt like hours as we waited, holding our breath, straining to hear anything that might give us a clue about what was happening. Suddenly, there was a loud crash followed by a piercing scream. James and I exchanged terrified glances, our hearts racing. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But how?" he asked, panic etched on his face. "There's no way we can get past them." We looked around the room, desperately searching for a way out. There was a small window above the bed, but it was sealed tight. I felt like we were trapped in a nightmare, every instinct screaming at us to escape. As the chaos continued outside, I made a decision. "We have to try. We can't just wait here to be found." James nodded, swallowing hard. "Okay, but we need a plan." We crept back to the door, listening intently. The voices were getting closer, and I felt a surge of adrenaline. I took a deep breath and opened the door just a crack, peeking out into the hallway. The sight before me sent chills down my spine. There were shadows moving down the hall, dark figures flitting in and out of the light, searching rooms, banging on doors. I could see the man from earlier, cornered at the far end of the hallway, being dragged away by two shadowy figures. He was screaming, and the sound sent a jolt of fear through me. "Now!" I hissed at James, pushing the door open wider and stepping into the hallway. We bolted down the corridor, hearts racing, adrenaline pumping through our veins. We could hear the footsteps behind us, the voices growing louder as they realized we were escaping. "Where do we go?" James shouted, panicking. "Out the back!" I yelled, veering towards a side door I had spotted earlier. We dashed towards it, our feet pounding against the floor. I grabbed the handle and yanked it open, the door swinging wide to reveal the darkness outside. We stumbled into the night, the cool air hitting our faces like a splash of cold water. We didn't stop to look back. We just ran. We sprinted towards the tree line. the shadows of the motel looming behind us. As we plunged into the woods, I could hear the angry shouts of the figures behind us, their footsteps echoing in the night. We ran until our legs burned, until we were gasping for breath. Finally, we slowed down, collapsing against a tree, trying to catch our breath. "What the hell was that?" James panted, his eyes wide with terror. "I don't know," I replied, still shaking. "But we need to get as far away from that place as possible." As we sat there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The woods felt alive, filled with unseen eyes watching our every move. We couldn't go back. We wouldn't go back. The motel was a dark memory now, but the fear lingered, a reminder of the shadows that lurked just beyond the light. Story 2. The Hitchhiker. The night was young when we hit the road, the car's headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. We were driving through the countryside, excited for a spontaneous weekend getaway. The roads were winding, framed by dense forests and the occasional glimpse of the moon peeking through the clouds. Laughter filled the car as we cranked up the music, feeling the thrill of adventure. A few hours into the drive, we took a detour on a lesser-known road. It was a risk, but the thrill of discovery fueled our excitement. As we drove deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around us, creating a tunnel of shadows. The air felt thick, charged with an energy that made me uneasy. It was then we saw him, a figure standing on the side of the road, thumbing for a ride. I slowed down, my instincts telling me to keep driving, but the others urged me to stop. "Come on, it's just a hitchhiker. What's the worst that could happen?" Sarah said, her voice cheerful as she leaned forward in her seat, eyes sparkling with curiosity. I hesitated, glancing at the stranger. He was a young man, maybe in his 20s, wearing a worn-out jacket and jeans. His hair was unkempt, and he had a wild look in his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. Still, I couldn't ignore the pleading look on his face. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. "Fine, but let's make it quick." The hitchhiker opened the door and climbed in, a grateful smile spreading across his face. "Thanks for stopping. I've been out here for hours." "No problem," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. "Where are you headed?" "Just a little further down the road," he said, glancing out the window. "Got lost during a hike, and my friends left me behind. I just need to get back to my car." I nodded, but something about his story felt off. The others seemed to feel it too. They exchanged uneasy glances. I tried to shake off the feeling and focus on the road, but an underlying tension settled in the car. As we drove on, the atmosphere grew heavier. The hitchhiker seemed nervous, fidgeting in his seat, glancing around as if he were expecting something, or someone. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, concern creeping into her voice. "You seem a bit anxious." He chuckled nervously, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, just, the woods can be a little creepy at night." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Yeah, I guess they can." The road twisted and turned, and the trees closed in tighter around us. The headlights illuminated the path ahead, but beyond the reach of the light, the darkness felt alive, almost suffocating. Suddenly, the hitchhiker's demeanor shifted. "You guys ever heard about the disappearances out here?" My heart raced as I glanced at the others, their faces reflecting the same unease I felt. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "People have gone missing in these woods. They say something's out there, something that takes people and never lets them go," he said, his voice low and serious. "Come on, man, don't scare us," Mark said, trying to lighten the mood. But there was an edge to his voice that suggested he didn't take it lightly. The hitchhiker turned to look at Mark, his eyes glinting in the darkness. "I'm serious. You should be careful. The forest has a way of swallowing you whole." His words hung heavy in the air, and I felt a cold chill creep down my spine. "Yeah, well, we're almost out of here, right?" I said, trying to reassure myself more than anyone else. But as we drove on, the trees seemed to loom closer, the shadows growing deeper. The hitchhiker was quiet now, his eyes scanning the woods outside as if searching for something. I stole glances at him in the rearview mirror, his expression tense and watchful. "Just a bit further," I said, trying to break the silence. "Where's your car parked?" "Not far from here," he replied, still not looking at me. "Just off the main road." That's when I saw it, a flash of movement in the trees. It was quick, just a glimpse of something darting between the trunks. My heart raced. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What?" the hitchhiker snapped, finally turning to face me. "Something. In the woods," I stammered, glancing nervously at the others. "Probably just an animal," he said, but there was an edge to his voice now, a tension that made my stomach drop. The trees felt like they were closing in around us, the shadows thickening, and I could feel the fear radiating from my friends. We needed to get out of here. I pressed on the accelerator, urging the car to go faster. Suddenly, the hitchhiker's demeanor shifted again. "Stop the car," he demanded, his voice cold and commanding. "What? Why?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "Stop, now!" he shouted, his eyes wild. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement. "What's wrong?" I asked, my heart racing. He was out of the car before I could respond, slamming the door behind him. "I can't go back, I can't!" "Wait!" I yelled, but he was already sprinting into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. "Should we go after him?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "No, we need to get out of here," I said, panic taking over. I threw the car in reverse and we sped back down the road, adrenaline coursing through our veins. We drove as fast as we could, the road blurring past us. The night felt alive, the shadows shifting and swirling around us. I could still hear the echo of the hitchhiker's frantic voice, the way his eyes had darted around as if something were after him. "Did you see that?" Mark said suddenly, his voice shaking. "What?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Back there, when he ran into the woods, there was something behind him." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. I just caught a glimpse of it. A shadow or something. It looked wrong." Panic surged through me, and I pushed the accelerator even harder, desperate to get away from whatever we had just encountered. The road felt endless, and the trees closed in tighter, the darkness swallowing us whole. We finally hit the main road, the familiar sights of civilization bringing a wave of relief. I didn't stop until we reached the nearest gas station, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. As we climbed out of the car, shaking and breathless, I glanced back at the road we had just come from. The woods were still and silent, but the memory of the hitchhiker, and the shadows that had chased him, lingered in the air. "What the hell just happened?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied, feeling a sense of dread settle in my gut. "But whatever it was, I never want to see it again." As we stood there, the safety of the gas station enveloping us, I realized that the darkness of the woods would always hold its secrets. Secrets that some were never meant to uncover. Story 3. The Forest of Whispers. It was a crisp autumn evening when my friends and I decided to take a road trip to a secluded campsite deep in the woods. The kind of place where you could escape the chaos of city life, surrounded by towering trees and the sounds of nature. We had heard stories about this campsite, a place rumored to be haunted by spirits of those who had gotten lost in the forest and never returned. But those were just stories, right? We laughed off the warnings, excited for a weekend of adventure. As we drove further away from civilization, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The trees grew thicker, their silhouettes looming over the winding road. We finally arrived at the campsite just as twilight settled in, casting an eerie glow around us. After setting up our tents, we gathered around the fire, the flames dancing as we roasted marshmallows and shared ghost stories. The woods surrounded us, and with every snap of a twig, I felt a sense of unease creeping in. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on my mind. All right, who wants to hear the real story behind this place? Jake, the most adventurous of our group, leaned forward, eyes glinting with excitement. Not another ghost story, Sarah groaned, rolling her eyes. No, really, he insisted. They say that if you listen closely at night, you can hear whispers coming from the trees. It's the lost souls trying to find their way back home. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I couldn't let my fear show. You're just trying to scare us, Jake, I said, forcing a laugh. As the night wore on, we retreated to our tents, the crackling fire fading behind us. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. Just as I began to drift off, I heard it, faint whispers drifting through the night air. I sat up, my heart racing. I convinced myself it was just the wind, but the whispers grew clearer, indistinguishable voices calling out from the shadows. Help! Find me! I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as my imagination. It's just a dream, I whispered to myself, but sleep wouldn't come. Hours later, I heard something outside, the sound of footsteps crunching on twigs. I nudged Jake, who was sleeping beside me. Jake, wake up, I hissed. What is it? He mumbled, rubbing his eyes. Did you hear that? He nodded, sitting up. Yeah, what is that? The footsteps grew closer, and I felt a surge of panic. We should check it out, I said, though every instinct in me screamed to stay put. We slowly unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the cool night air hitting our faces. The forest was alive with sounds, but the whispers had ceased. Hello? Jake called out, his voice echoing into the darkness. Silence. We ventured a few steps away from the tent, and that's when I saw it. A faint glow flickering in the distance, deeper into the woods. What's that? I whispered, pointing. Let's go check it out, Jake said, his curiosity overpowering his fear. Against my better judgment, I nodded. We crept through the underbrush, the branches clawing at our arms and legs as we made our way toward the light. The whispers returned, swirling around us like a cold breeze. Help! Find me! I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. Did you hear that? I whispered, panic rising. Yeah, Jake replied, his voice low. It's coming from over there. We continued onward, the glow growing brighter, revealing a clearing in the woods. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, the windows shattered, and the door swinging on its hinges. The light emanated from within, casting eerie shadows on the trees around us. We should go back, I said, but Jake was already moving toward the cabin. Just a quick look, he said, stepping inside. I hesitated but followed him, the whispers growing louder with each step. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with decay. The light flickered erratically, revealing remnants of what once was. A table covered in dust, a broken chair, and old photographs scattered on the floor. As we moved further in, I spotted a photo of a family hanging on the wall, their faces smiling, oblivious to the horror that would unfold in that very place. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us, and I jumped, my heart racing. Jake! I yelled, panic flooding my voice. Don't freak out, it's probably just the wind, he said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his tone. Then we heard it. A soft, melodic voice singing from the shadows, luring us deeper into the cabin. Come play with me, don't be afraid. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. We need to leave now, I screamed, but Jake seemed entranced, moving toward the voice. Jake, don't! I pleaded, grabbing his arm. but he shook me off, stepping into the darkness where the singing was coming from. "Just a little closer," he murmured, eyes glazed over. I felt a surge of fear as I realized he was under some sort of spell. "Jake, please," I shouted, my voice breaking. But he continued to walk toward the voice, and I knew I had to act fast. I turned to run toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic clawed at my throat as I banged on the door, desperate to escape. "Help! Let us out!" I cried. But the cabin felt alive, almost as if it were trapping us inside. The singing grew louder, a haunting melody that echoed in my mind. I turned back to see Jake standing in the shadows, completely still now, staring at something I couldn't see. "Jake!" I shouted again, my heart pounding. Then I heard it, a low growl emanating from the darkness. The shadows seemed to shift, and I could feel a presence lurking just beyond my line of sight. I grabbed a broken chair leg from the floor, ready to defend myself. "Get away from him!" I yelled, brandishing the makeshift weapon. But it was too late. The shadows converged around Jake, wrapping around him like tendrils, pulling him into the darkness. "Help me!" he screamed, terror flooding his voice. "Jake!" I lunged forward, but the shadows pushed me back, pinning me against the wall. I struggled against the invisible force, panic flooding my senses as I watched my friend disappear into the darkness. "Please, no!" I screamed, tears streaming down my face. The cabin shook, and I felt the floor tremble beneath me. The whispers crescendoed into a cacophony of voices, all crying out, begging for help. "Join us. Join us." I felt the darkness closing in, suffocating me, and I knew I had to escape. Summoning every ounce of strength, I charged at the door again, throwing my body against it with everything I had. With a loud crash, the door burst open, and I tumbled out into the night, gasping for breath. I looked back, heart racing, but the cabin was gone. The clearing was empty, swallowed by the woods as if it had never existed. I stumbled back to our campsite, the whispers still echoing in my ears. I found Sarah and Mark huddled around the dying fire, their faces pale with fear. "Where's Jake?" Sarah asked, panic etched across her features. "I don't know," I gasped, collapsing to the ground. He's gone." We packed our things in a frenzy, adrenaline coursing through our veins. As we drove away from the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching us from the trees, the whispers lingering in the air. Even now, I can still hear them sometimes. The calls of the lost souls, begging for help. And I know that somewhere in those woods, the cabin still stands, waiting for the next unsuspecting travelers to fall under its spell. Story 4. The Strangers at the Rest Stop. It had been a long day of driving. My two friends, Mark and Lisa, and I had been on the road since early morning, winding through small towns and endless stretches of open highway. We were on a cross-country road trip, aiming to cover as much ground as possible before the sun dipped below the horizon. We had been talking about taking this trip for years, and now that it was finally happening, the excitement had morphed into a haze of exhaustion. We hadn't seen another car for miles, and the isolation of the road started to feel more oppressive than freeing. Mark was in the passenger seat, dozing off, while Lisa was in the back, flipping through her phone, trying to get a signal. "Should we stop for a break?" I asked, my voice cutting through the monotony of the hum of the engine. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was already past 10 p.m. "Yeah, I could use a bathroom," Lisa mumbled from the back seat, her eyes never leaving her phone. "Besides, we're out of snacks." Mark stirred awake. "Good idea. Maybe we can find a rest stop or something." The GPS wasn't giving us many options, and the closest rest stop seemed to be about 20 miles away, just off the highway. It wasn't ideal, but we decided to push on and make it there. The road stretched ahead, seemingly endless, lit only by the car's headlights cutting through the pitch-black night. The further we drove, the more isolated I felt, Finally, we saw the sign for the rest stop. It was an old, worn-out sign that had clearly seen better days. Rest stop ahead, 2 miles. Relief washed over us, but something about the sign, and the idea of pulling into such a remote location this late at night, felt unnerving. We pulled into the parking lot, and I immediately noticed how deserted it was. The building looked old, almost abandoned, and the flickering fluorescent light above the restrooms did nothing to comfort me. Still, we were all tired, and I convinced myself it was just my nerves from the long day of driving. There was nothing out here. No other cars, no people, just us. "I'll go check out the bathrooms," Lisa said, already stepping out of the car. "You two want anything from the vending machine?" "Grab me a Coke," Mark yawned, stretching his legs as he got out of the car. "I'll go with you." I stayed in the car for a moment, leaning back into the seat and closing my eyes, trying to shake off the fatigue. The wind was picking up, rustling the nearby trees, and there was an unsettling silence that followed it. It was strange. Rest stops, even at night, usually had some sense of life, whether it was truckers resting or the faint hum of passing cars. But here, nothing. After a few minutes, I realized they hadn't come back yet. The feeling of unease that had been creeping up on me grew stronger, so I decided to get out and check on them. As I approached the restroom area, I noticed something odd. The vending machine was unplugged, its cord coiled neatly at the base. Yet I could hear the faint sound of clinking coins from inside the machine. I paused, my heart rate picking up as I walked closer to the restrooms. The bathroom doors creaked as I pushed them open, and the smell of mildew hit me immediately. It was damp, and the flickering lights made it even more unsettling. "Lisa? Mark?" I called out, but my voice echoed back to me, swallowed by the thick silence of the place. There was no answer. I stepped further inside, feeling the damp floor beneath my shoes. A line of graffiti-covered stalls stood in front of me, each one with the door slightly ajar. I walked down the row, pushing each door open. Nothing. No one was there. Panic started to rise in my chest. Where could they have gone? I quickly left the restroom and headed back toward the car, hoping they might have just gone back without telling me. But as I approached the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Both the driver's and passenger's side doors were wide open. The keys were still in the ignition. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, unsure of what to do next. That's when I heard it. A soft, distant murmur of voices. They were coming from the woods just beyond the rest stop, faint but unmistakable. I froze, listening closely, trying to make out what they were saying. The voices sounded strange, disjointed, as if multiple people were speaking at once, but I couldn't understand the words. Against every instinct screaming at me to get in the car and leave, I found myself slowly walking toward the edge of the woods, my curiosity overpowering my fear. The deeper I walked into the woods, the louder the voices became. They were clearer now, but still foreign, like they were speaking a language I couldn't comprehend. I kept moving, stepping over fallen branches and pushing through the thick undergrowth. And then I saw them. At first, it was just a glimpse, a flicker of movement in the darkness. Then, as I got closer, I saw Mark and Lisa standing in a small clearing, completely still. Their backs were to me, and they were staring into the trees. I called out to them, but they didn't respond. They didn't even turn around. I quickened my pace, my panic growing. "Mark! Lisa, what are you doing?" I yelled, but they remained motionless, as if they couldn't hear me. When I finally reached them, I grabbed Mark's shoulder to turn him around, but the moment I touched him, he jerked violently away from me, his face twisted in fear. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, his voice low and panicked. "I was looking for you. What the hell is going on?" I demanded, my own voice shaking. "Shh," Lisa whispered urgently, finally turning to face me. Her eyes were wide, her face pale as if she had seen something terrifying. "They'll hear you." "Who? What are you talking about?" I asked, glancing around, but I saw nothing. "They're watching us," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. "We can't leave. They won't let us." Before I could ask what he meant, I saw something move in the trees behind them. At first, it looked like shadows shifting between the branches, but then I realized they weren't shadows at all. Figures, dozens of them, were standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. They were completely still, their faces hidden in the darkness, but I could feel their eyes on us. "Who are they?" I whispered, my throat tightening with fear. "We don't know," Lisa replied, her voice trembling. "But they've been here, waiting." "Waiting for what?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "To take us," Mark said, his voice hollow. "They're the ones who never left." I stared at the figures, trying to comprehend what was happening. The air around us felt thick, suffocating, and I could barely breathe. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but my legs felt frozen in place. The figures started to move, slowly stepping out of the shadows, their faces still hidden. "We need to leave," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "We can't," Lisa said, her eyes filling with tears. "They won't let us leave." I looked at the figures, now closing in on us, and for the first time I saw their faces. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed, their skin pale and stretched tight over their bones. They looked like they had been there for years, trapped in the woods, waiting for someone to join them. "No," I whispered, taking a step back. "We have to go now." Without waiting for a response, I grabbed Lisa's arm and yanked her toward the path back to the rest stop. Mark followed, his breath ragged with fear. We ran as fast as we could, the figures closing in behind us. I could hear them now, their whispers, their footsteps growing louder, closer. We burst out of the woods and sprinted toward the car. I jumped into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys still in the ignition. Lisa and Mark threw themselves into the back seat, slamming the doors shut. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Without looking back, I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires screeching as we tore out of the parking lot and back onto the highway. For the next hour, none of us said a word. The road stretched ahead of us, empty and dark, but I could still feel them, those figures watching us from the trees, waiting for their next victims. We never spoke about that night again. But every time I pass a rest stop, I can't help but wonder how many others have disappeared, how many are still out there, waiting. Thanks for joining us on this dark journey. If you enjoyed these terrifying tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more spine-chilling stories. Until next time, stay safe on the roads. You never know what's out there.